In my day job, I'm Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Collegiate Church Corporation, which has a long history going back to New Amsterdam. So we're very proud to be a part of this wonderful organization, New Amsterdam History Center. In your chairs, you have a page here that describes who we are as New Amsterdam History Center and talks about our mission and our endeavors to educate the public on New Amsterdam and more broadly the New Netherlands story. I'd like to start off by just asking my fellow trustees of EsmeNAHC to rise so they can be recognized. You probably know a lot of these folks. Please, trustees. That's great. And before we move into the program, it has been called to my attention that we lost an important person who was a part of our History Center circle, Walter Leakey, who was a person who perished in the tragic MTA accident last week. So, he had attended several of our events, and many of you may know that he was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he curated European paintings. So, a member of our family, so to speak, and let's take just a second or two to of silence to remember Walter. Thank you. Okay, let me start here by thanking the General Consulate of the Netherlands, for Rob Voss, and for Ryan Emmen, who's been such a good host and such a good partner in all of these events. So let's recognize the Consulate. The Consulate General has been an extremely important part of our lecture series, which we continue tonight. And doing so, I'd like to introduce our speakers. That's why you came here, to hear from Charlie and from Lynn, and also to bring to your attention that in the back we have a print of Lynn Tantillo that you should take a look at. It's for a silent auction. There's an opening bid I think everybody can achieve. So we'd like to have a number of people help us with that silent auction, because it is a fundraiser for EsmeNAHC, and we will ask you when this presentation is over at the end to take a look at the print and put in a bid. So, and I'd like for Lynn, the artist, to tell us a little bit about it.
Well, welcome. It's great to see such a fantastic crowd this evening. The print that's being auctioned is this image. It's a painting that I made for Andy Hendricks. Some of you know Andy. His family originally owned a piece of property in Manhattan, and as it turned out, that piece of property was located at the southeastern corner of the World Trade Center site. And on that piece of land, his family built that windmill. It was called the Messier Mill. So the painting has an interesting history, and is probably one of the most well-known sites right now in the world. So I hope that some lucky person gets to take that home with them tonight. So here you go, Casey.
So please stop by the table in the back and put in your bid. And also, if you're not interested in that, we do take checks for donations. So, and Ashley, my assistant, will be in the back. Ashley's raising her hand, so take a look. If you're so motivated, please help us out with our mission and make a contribution before the evening is over. And before we turn now to tonight's program, I'd like to ask my fellow trustee, Esme Berg, to talk to us a little bit about upcoming events.
Good evening and welcome, and thank you all for coming. I just wanted to mention that we have some wonderful events coming up in the near future. It's wonderful to see you all here tonight, and I hope to see you all again on April 15th at Columbia University, Deutsche where we're going to have our trustee Firth Fabian will be giving a talk. And The next event will be in October 26th. Please mark your calendars because we're going to have an amazing talk, rather panel discussion about the history of the waterways of New York. Russell Shorto will be our moderator. Len Tantillo will be giving a presentation, as well as Hank Elving, and maybe others. So it's going to be a very exciting event. It will be at the CUNY Grad Center on 5th Avenue and 34th Street. And we look forward to seeing you all again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Esme, for all the work you do for NAHC. So now just a brief introduction, because I think the reason most of you are here is because you know these two gentlemen and know what contributions they've made to the mission that we feel so strongly about. So first, Charlie Gehring, 40 years of experience as historian and translator of the colonial Dutch documents, which are housed in Albany. And also Lynn Tantillo, who has 30 years as a historic artist specializing in 17th century New York. So I think they almost need no introduction. And I would like to turn to, I think, Charlie, you're going to start, are you? Or Lynn? You guys are going to kind of wing it, right? Okay. All right, who's up? There you go.
Charlie and I have done this program a few times.
That's me.
Yeah.
Yanni Feeneman is right over here. She's worked with me for 30 years of the 40 years, and unfortunately she can't be here tonight because last year she had a double hip operation, and she had to have one of the hips redone, and she's convalescing for about 4 months now. Is this working? Yes. All right.
Well, anyway, Charlie and I have known each other for about 30 years. And before we really get into the program, I just wanted to say that not only has he made an incredible contribution to our knowledge of New York's colonial past, but Charlie has inspired a number of people who've gone on and kind of taken up the cause. Probably maybe the most well-known right now would be someone like Russell Shorto, whose book Island at the Center of the World was in part inspired by all of Charlie's incredible research. My career was inspired by Charlie, and even to this day we see each other often, and we basically feed off of each other. So I just wanted to thank you publicly for being a good friend and an inspiration. This is where we are. We always like to kind of get through the basics first. The United States of America, a world power, the most powerful navy in the world. And New York is a part of this huge nation. 400 years ago, a much smaller country dominated the seas. A country that most people don't have a sense of its physical size. So if you take a look at the United States, and you take a look at New York State, this is in scale. That's the Netherlands. Nice. Easily fits inside New York State. It's about 1/3 of the land area of New York. And yet this country became a world power. So I guess we're going to talk a little bit about Manhattan and the connection with Amsterdam.
Right, what should be mentioned about the Netherlands in the 17th century is it's incredible that a country of only 1.5 million people was able to accomplish what it did. At any given time it had probably almost 500 to 1,000 ships at sea, thousands of seamen all over the world. And it's a tribute to the people of the Netherlands that they were actually able to survive in this area of the world at all. And I'll talk a little bit about that, about the water problems in a few minutes. I want to go back to the city. We all recognize Manhattan. It's a world leader, industrial leader, commercial, financial, cultural, intellectual leader. And this is what Amsterdam in the Netherlands was in the 17th century. The Dutch brought over all of their attributes to the New World and embedded them in the country. They cast very deep roots. There are several books written about the Netherlands or New Netherland minimizing the contributions of what the Dutch did. And that practically nothing happened until the English arrived. That is not the case. This one author, in fact, writes about Beverwijk, where Albany is today, and says that it's just an aggregate of 250 fur traders. Actually, it was the same size, about 1,000 people, the same size as Manhattan in the 1650s. And we should never minimalize what the Dutch were able to accomplish in that period of time up till 1664. And then don't ever forget that they were able to come back in 1673 for 14 months and held the territory until it was negotiated back to the English. This is Amsterdam, again showing the vitality of the city, a intellectual leader, economic powerhouse. They were part of the Habsburg Empire, and their part of the Habsburg Empire was to sail all over the world with the Spanish and the Portuguese. And this is how they learned a lot of their navigational skills and also world trade routes, which would serve them well later. Now, when we look at Amsterdam and New York, you ask yourself the question, if you were coming over here to found a colony, where would you make the center of your colony? And people would immediately think of New York. Of course, Manhattan is obvious. No one would ever think of going any other place. In fact, there's a famous, not a famous novel, thank God, but there's a novel that appeared back in the, I'm not even going to mention the title because I don't want you to read it, back in the 1970s, where he has Peter Minuet stand up in the Staten General in this big auditorium and say, we must buy Manhattan. We must, that is the future, and so forth. And this is how everything got started. And he's even so bold in his introduction to state that this is all based on fact. that I weave a little bit of fiction in, but most everything is based on fact. And once I read that, I said, boy, this guy, and it's a story of New York City. It's in 3 volumes. The first volume is about the Dutch. If you want to know what it is, I'll tell you later, but I'm not going to disseminate any more than that. So Manhattan wasn't the first choice, but what was the first choice? The West India Company was founded in 1621. They had to wait for about 2 years before they got enough capital together because of the war with Spain started again after the truce failed at the same time, 1621. And they explored various areas in the New World and decided that Burlington Island, is anyone here familiar with Burlington Island or Burlington, New Jersey? It's just south of Trenton, New Jersey. There's an island. I think it might be a place where they dump waste now or something. In fact, it was used as a dumping site. But the Dutch put a fort on the south end of Burlington Island called Fort Wilhelmus in 1624. They built that the same time they built Fort Orange, and they built a fort on Governor's Island. These were the 3 major posts at that time. And they decided that they had to keep the center of the colony in a place that was a milder climate. And they had been misinformed by someone that the Delaware River Valley was like Florida. And we all know that it's hardly the case. In fact, in the 17th century, during the mini ice age, the Delaware River used to freeze consistently. You could walk across from Philadelphia to the other side, walk over to Camden, New Jersey on the ice. And the Indians frequently did that. They would go into the Dutch fort, Fort Nassau, and spend time there during their hunting season, because the Dutch only manned the fort seasonally. But they soon found out that this was not to be the place for the center. They decided on Manhattan for various reasons, but they knew that it had a ice-free port. It's very deep around the edges of the island, so you can get ships in you that drew a lot of water. That it was big enough for supporting farms, and it was the end of a river system that brought the furs down from the north. If you look at a map, for example, this 1651 map, you see the Mohawk River flowing into the Hudson River. This is the only entrance to the center of the country at that time until 1751. The St. Lawrence River, of course, is under the control of the French at that time. So below the St. Lawrence, this is the only way to get to the interior of the country until the Cumberland Gap is found in 1751. So he decided that the logical place for the center would be Manhattan. And they started bringing animals over in 1625. They brought a fleet of ships over with animals. The ships were all outfitted with stables, and it was a very well thought out fleet of ships, the so-called animal fleet. The Scott, and the Coup, I think, for the three ships. They named them after three animals. But they all survived, and they got to the island where some of them died immediately for eating noxious weeds, unfortunately. But they buy the island from the local Indians, and you saw in the very beginning the Schagen letter that shows, indicates that the island had been bought for 60 guilders. And the major problem with this is it doesn't say exactly when it was purchased or who purchased it. And to some people, this is the most important thing in the world. To me, it doesn't make any difference. I'd like to know who actually negotiated for the island, whether it was for Holst or Minuit. And to some people, whether the date was 1625 or 1626 is extremely important. In fact, there's an obsession based on this. You don't realize this, but these are the things that we have to deal with from time to time. And I recently found a date. In the Executive Council minutes of Governor Lovelace, 1670, the Indians are coming to see proof that they actually had a bill of sale or legal grounds for purchasing Staten Island and Manhattan Island. The Dutch had a document they showed the Indians. They were satisfied with that. And they look at the document, which doesn't survive anymore, for Manhattan Island. And it's very clearly stated that the island was purchased 44 years ago. If you do the math from 1670 and subtract 44, you get 1626, not 1625. So if it makes any difference to anyone out there what year it is, here we have a date. We still don't know whether it's Minuit or Verhulst. That's my statement tonight. I had to get that off my chest because it's been I've been harassed by certain people about this for some time. Now, the question is, what were the Dutch doing here in the first place? I mean, we can go through all of the early explorations and so forth, but why? Why were they here? Why were the Dutch here? Why a country of 1.5 million people? Why were they in this part of the world? Of course, it goes back to Hudson, and he had already laid out the territory through his explorations for the East India Company. But this is what Europe looks like in the 17th, or actually in the 16th century. The Netherlands is part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire. Let me see if I can get this to work. You see these stripes? They're all part of Spain, of the Spanish Empire. So that's why I said earlier that it was very important for the Dutch to be part of the Habsburg Empire, because this is where they learned global trade. This is where they learned about navigation, shipbuilding, how to use a cannon, for example. The Dutch and Germans become the cannoneers for the Habsburg or the Spanish and Portuguese navies, because apparently I read somewhere that the Spanish especially thought that it was ungentlemanly to shoot at somebody at a distance, so they let the Germans and the Dutch do it aboard ship. This area was acquired by the Habsburgs through love and war, mostly through war. Somebody said there's more Venus involved than Mars in the acquisition. And in 1568, a war broke out between the Dutch provinces of the Low Countries and the Habsburg Empire, both for political and religious reasons, which I won't go into, but it was a very nasty period of time. And it went on for 80 years with a 12-year truce right in the middle. The 12-year truce coincides with Hudson's explorations in 1609. That's when the truce begins. This allows the Dutch to send explorers out to look for safer trade routes, and ends 12 years later in 1621 when the West India Company is founded to resume the war with Spain. This is Dutch sea power. Again, thousands of ships. They were equal or more equal than the English at this time. They say that the Spanish probably, because of their wars with Spain, or with the Dutch, lost their sea power. The Dutch beat them over and over again, especially in 1602. These are the Dutch trade routes. In 1609, Hudson is set off to try to find this route. Every Dutch kid probably knows about Willem Barent. He winters over the overwintering van Willem Barent. The Barents Sea is named after him. He gets up to here and has to spend the winter blocked in by the ice. Hudson gets about this far, turns back and comes all the way over here, and eventually lays out the territory that becomes New Netherland. It's interesting that that sea lane is now open. The Russians are using it to move to the east.
One of the things that we're trying to do with this program this evening is to provide people with kind of a general overview of how New Netherland functioned. Not specifically how any one area or any one person contributed to its success, but how it worked as a community, how all the parts came together to make it a successful colony. One of the things that Charlie likes to point out is the the similarity between the importance of a three-river system in the Netherlands, and maybe you want to just mention and point it out.
Right, the three major rivers, the Netherlands is basically a delta of three rivers, the Rhine, the Maas, and the Scheldt. They all flow into this area of the Netherlands, and it's made it possible for people from the interior of the country to move west and to end up in the Netherlands. So it's a very common fact that a lot of the Eastern Europeans actually end up in New Netherlands by following the rivers down to the Netherlands and then eventually to New Netherlands.
And one of the things that we notice right away about New Netherlands is that those three rivers that make up the mechanics, the basis for the colony, can be seen with the Hudson, the Connecticut River, and the Delaware River. Now, the Hudson River branches off into the Mohawk, as Charlie mentioned, but that orange band is really essentially New Netherlands in the mid-17th century. When I made this map, I kind of intentionally made that band, it's orange obviously, but it also looks like a rubber band. And I did that because New Netherlands actually changed. It continually changed. Their hopes for developing the three-river system didn't really materialize. So we have the three-river system, and we have the first settlement, Fort Nassau, on the upper Hudson River near where Albany is today. And then over a period of time, we have a fort on the Delaware River, and we have a fort on the Connecticut River. And the scale of the picture of the beaver indicates not just the fact that they were after the beaver, but also where the furs were the most plentiful. So you can see that the middle of New York State was the most advantageous place to trade with the Indians for fur.
Want me to mention something about the Delaware? This is usually considered the most important of the rivers, the Hudson-Mohawk configuration, because, like I said, it gains access to the interior of the country, and this is where the furs were. As the beavers were hunted out in this area, they had to go further and further to the west, or rely on Indians from the west to bring beavers into the Iroquois, and then eventually to Fort Orange, and then down the river. But the Dutch recognized the importance of the Delaware very early. In 1615, 3 explorers from Fort Nassau wander off looking for precious metals to the west and are captured by Indians in this area of the Delaware and are brought all the way down here and are ransomed the next spring by another Dutch ship. And so very early the Dutch knew the configuration of this river. The English never really understood it. If they had understood from Maryland what the importance of this river was, they would have taken it immediately, because it goes right up into the fur-bearing country and also behind the biggest plantation in New Netherlands, Rensselaerswijk. And Stuyvesant makes the comment that if they ever discover this river and take possession of the Delaware River, the South River, as they call it, the South River, we might as well go back home, because it'll be all over. They will have succeeded in capturing the fur trade.
So the furs are brought via the river systems to Manhattan, which is the hub of New Netherlands, and then from there they're shipped back to Europe. So we're going to take a look at each of the 3 river systems: the North River, the Hudson River. Charlie mentioned Henry Hudson In 1609, Hudson makes his way up the river, discovers that the land is potentially bountiful. The people that he encounters in the upper Hudson seem to be friendly, and it's because furs are the commodity to be traded. This seems like it's going to be a very lucrative operation. The area is vast and desolate, and into this environment, as he makes his way upriver, he encounters two groups of native people. Mohicans, who are Algonquian-speaking people. They live an agrarian life. They have their farmland mostly along the Hudson River and along the creeks of the Hudson. This is a site called Papscany. It's 6 miles south of Albany, and archaeologists back in the 90s conducted a number of investigations of this site and actually discovered the post molds for the structures that you see in the painting. And the Mohawks. They are Iroquoian, one of the 5 tribes of the Iroquois Nation. They generally reside more toward the middle of New York State, western New York. And they're quite different. They have large communities. They live in basically small towns. Some of them, like this one in Montgomery County, is about 200 people. They live in long houses, and the Dutch are able to communicate and trade with both of these Indian groups. In 1614, Adrian Block builds Fort Nassau, which we mentioned earlier. The fort is built in the upper Hudson River. And a number of years ago, about 14 years ago, I made this painting of Fort Nassau. And maybe some of you attended the New Netherland Institute seminar this past fall. But during that program, I did a rather extensive study of Fort Nassau, and actually came up with something that I think looked a little bit more like it than this painting that I did so many years ago. I haven't painted it, but I built several digital models. I think the building itself looks something like that. I think the fort looks something like this. And if you were actually there sort of looking at it, it would have been more like that. So you get a sense of how unimpressive this is. And I think sometimes when we read the documents, we think of this very sophisticated early operation into the New World. But this is what the foothold looks like. Now, it evolves rather rapidly. This is Fort Orange in the 1650s. So after 40 years of development, a community has started to develop around the fort. It's a wooden fort. It's very modest. There are some buildings inside the original settlers, but it quickly outgrows its perimeter, and Beverwyck starts to spring up around it. Immigrants are arriving. Tradesmen are arriving, and Beverwyck sort of becomes a dynamic community. And I think it would be good, Charlie, to kind of give us a little bit of background about the conflict that occurs between the company and the civilian population, because that's not only happening in Albany, but it's happening in Manhattan as well.
Right. In order to encourage colonists to come over to the New World, the West India Company starts a program called the Patroonship Program, or the privatization of colonization, I like to call it. The Dutch were one of the first to try to privatize everything. With the companies, they were actually privatizing foreign policy, if you think about it, in various parts of the world. And here they were privatizing colonization by allowing wealthy people, usually a director of the company, to acquire land in the New World, as long as they brought them over, set them up on a farm, provided them with seed cattle, livestock, and they would be able to pass this land on by through inheritance. And the only one that actually survived was Kilian van Rensselaer's large patroon ship that covers basically, if you look at a map of New York, it's basically Albany and Rensselaer counties, with part of Columbia County to the south of Rensselaer County. That's about 1 million acres of land, which was held by the heirs of the patroon until just before the Civil War, actually. The fort, the company fort, was right in the middle of the patroon ship. For a period of time, they got along fine. The company used the patroon ship as a place for providing goods and services for the soldiers in the fort, providing wheat, which was made either into bread or beer. At that time, two of the staples of the diet of the 17th century were bread and beer. People ate bread and something else with bread. They drank beer, a very low alcohol percentage, but it was the only safe water liquid to drink at that time. A dispute arose when a new director was appointed by the patroons, heirs of the patroon, a man by the name of Brandt van Slichtenhorst. He was, Stuyvesant was director of the colony at that time. Slichtenhorst was about 20-some years older than Stuyvesant. And I have always had this feeling when you read the documents and so forth that because of the age difference, Slichtenhorst thought that he was a little bit better than Stuyvesant, that he was a little bit smarter, that he could do things that you normally wouldn't be able to do, that Stuyvesant wouldn't be able to resist him. Well, Stuyvesant was a little more clever than that. He was a very astute administrator and a very clever person. They got into an argument about building houses up close to the fort. The West India Company wanted to protect the Vrijheid van het fort, the liberty of the fort. In other words, there had to be an open area around the fort so that the cannons could clear anyone approaching the fort within 3,000 feet. This is the so-called cannon shot around the fort, Fort Orange. And he refused to recognize that. They came up, West India Company soldiers came up and they put placards on the walls and stating that this was a regulation, and Slichtenhorst had them torn down. Stuyvesant calls him down to Manhattan for consultation. And just to show you that how the thinking of Slichtenhorst, he actually accepted the invitation and went down, not knowing that he was going to be thrown in jail immediately, which he was. He was incarcerated, he escaped from the jail, made it back up river, did the same thing, started building more houses, and in fact, he built houses in fee simple, which further irritated Stuyvesant because that meant they could do whatever they wanted with that property. And Stuyvesant finally had him arrested and sent back to the Netherlands. And the 3,000 feet around the fort becomes what is Albany today, the city of Albany. It took in all of the craftsmen, all of the blacksmiths, coopers, and so forth that the patroon had sent over. They all now resided within the jurisdiction of the West India Company. They had to abjure their oath to the patroon and swear an oath to the West India Company now.
This is a painting titled The Ferry, and in the background you can see Fort Orange and a little bay, and we know that these structures, houses and barns of this type, boards and straw, started to crop up around the fort because Father Isaac Jogues, who was a prisoner of the Mohawks and rescued by the Dutch, writes about this. He tells us what they look like, and he tells us that they are built in a haphazard way around the fort. But immigrants continue to arrive, and Beverwyck continues to develop. Now there's enough control in Beverwyck itself because of restrictions that are put on residents by the patroon, where a number of more adventurous immigrants decide to live outside the fort, whether they do this because they think they'll have an advantage in the fur trade, or whether they do this just to start to live a less restricted life. It could be both of those things. But this is an example of a house built on the Papskenny Creek, again, about 6 or 7 miles south of Albany. The house was built by Tenoos Dirkse van Vechten, and there are a number of small structures like that that are springing up in that area. Van Vechten owned a yacht. This is the Seahorse. He was a partner in this vessel, and this was how trade was conducted on the river. They would collect cargoes in the Albany area and take them to New York. North of the fort was a piece of property which later became the mansion of the Schuyler family. But back in the 1640s and 50s, a man named Aaron Van Curler settled there and lived in a house barn. So he was, his world was more oriented toward the Mohawk lifestyle, where Van Vechten was dealing with and working with the Mohican people. This is the ship that was owned by Van Curler. It was a bark. We don't know the name of the ship, but we know that he owned at one time 2 of these vessels, and they would carry on trade in the Hudson River and also beyond into the rest of New Netherland. This painting is called Curiosity of the Magua. Those are Mohawks in elm bark canoes. Van Curler raised horses and cattle. The Indians, particularly the Iroquois, weren't very interested in having horses, but this painting was meant to depict kind of an early encounter between some warriors, and you probably can't see it, but on the deck of that ship are some horses.
Well, it should be mentioned that the Dutch wouldn't have let the Indians have horses.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was an advantage that the Dutch had over the Native Americans or the Indians in the area, was being on horseback. And whenever the Indians needed horses to pull large logs out of the woods to repair their stockades or whatever, they had to go to Fort Orange and petition for the use of horses. And in most cases, the Dutch would send a guy up with a team of horses to help them pull logs out of the woods, and this went on for years. And also for plowing, they would go up into the Mohawk Valley on a regular basis and plow fields for the Mohawks, but they weren't allowed to ride a horse.
This is the north end of Castle Island near Albany. There were a couple of small farms there, and at one time, one of those farms was owned by another character who was pretty significant in the development of New Netherland, Adrian Vanderdonk. The ship that you see here is a bark similar to the one that was owned by Van Curler, and this is typical of the way Dutch would load and offload their ships before they had built any substantial docks. on the Hudson. They would do what they did in Europe. They would run the vessel aground at high tide. Albany has a tide of 6 feet. When the tide went out, the ships sort of settled onto the mud. They'd put planks out onto the mud, load and offload the ships, and then when the tide came back in, off they would go. The South River has a very different story because the South River involves the Swedes. Charlie, maybe you could give a little background on Fort Christina and Fort Nassau on the Delaware.
I mentioned Peter Minuit. He's sometimes mostly considered the person who bought Manhattan Island in 1626, but it can be argued. But he was sent back to the Netherlands and replaced in 1631, and he was unemployed, and he came to the attention of the Swedes and some Dutch investors like Samuel Blommaert. The Dutch were very heavy investors in the copper mines in Sweden, in northern Sweden, and as was Samuel Blommaert. And they hired him to found a colony in the New World. And Minuit knew where everything was over here. He had been from one end of New Netherland to the other. In fact, he was over here with Verhulst as a volunteer in 1625, exploring for minerals and precious metals and so forth. So he knew the territory. And he knew right where to go, where the Dutch were the weakest, and that was on the Delaware River. And he came over with 2 ships and bought a small chunk of land from the Indians and built a fort called Christina, after Queen Christina, who was queen in Sweden at that time. She was very interested in this whole project, apparently.
But with the arrival of the Swedes, the colony of New Netherland was threatened, as Charlie mentioned. The Dutch felt that they had to control the Delaware River, and so this peculiar kind of hopscotch game occurred of building a fort closer to the mouth of the Delaware River. So the original Dutch fort was located near Camden, New Jersey. When the Swedes come, the Swedes build their fort at Wilmington. And, oh, well, I should mention that the Dutch have a fort here that doesn't last very long, Swanendal. It only lasts a couple of years and the occupants disappear. But as this Dutch and Swedish competition begins, the Dutch finally build a fort called Fort Casimir. This is the Swedish fort at Wilmington, Delaware. This is the Dutch Fort Casimir at Newcastle, Delaware. And so the Dutch could control the ships that were the Swedish ships that were trying to make their way to Fort Christina. Well, this went on for not a very long period of time, probably about a year and a half or something like that.
Well, Casimir was built in 1651, and in 1654, the Swedes captured Fort Casimir.
Yeah. And
much
so,
to Stuyvesant's annoyance.
The strange thing about that event was that the Swedes could have just sailed past Fort Casimir. It was a wreck. That's what it looked like. I mean, you read the documents and it's falling apart. They have 2 broken guns. There are 3 soldiers there. The Swedes could have supplied their fort, Fort Casimir, with ease. They could just sail past this fort. There wasn't going to be any resistance at all. But on board that vessel, it was decided that they would take Fort Casimir once and for all away from the Dutch. So their ships anchor there, their soldiers come ashore, there are these bedraggled Dutchmen there, and when they're asked to surrender, the Dutch say, "Can you give us a ride to New York?" So that was it. And but that isn't how it registers with Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant doesn't like this at all. and Stuyvesant comes down really hard on the Swedes. He sends warships, and he sends, I forget how many soldiers there to take this back.
There are about 350 soldiers he sends down on 7 ships, including a large warship loaned by the city of Amsterdam called the Waag. And this has 40 soldiers and sailors aboard, or no, more than that, it has 40 guns aboard and a couple hundred soldiers and sailors. It's a big ship, and there's no way the Swedes are going to defend against this as part of Stuyvesant's invasion fleet.
So New Sweden falls and becomes under the complete control of the Dutch. This is a sort of a site plan that shows the fort and the landing, this sort of swampy area around it, and this little community that's springing up around the fort. The interesting thing about the area in and around Fort Casimir, Newcastle, Delaware, is that Stuyvesant owes Amsterdam for the use of their warship. And so this kind of sub-colony begins here called New Amstel. And you might want to say a few words about New Amstel.
Right, it becomes a colony within a colony. Actually, the Dutch never call New Nederland a colony. It's always a provincie. It's never called a colony. Rensselaerswijk is called a colony. In fact, we still have colony if you're familiar with upstate New York, and that's part of the patroonship. And Nieuw Amstel was also a colony, and they were run. The colony of Nieuw Amstel was run by the mayors of Amsterdam. It was a very unusual situation where the mayors of Amsterdam had control of a colony in the New World. And eventually, the West India Company ceded the whole river to Nieuw Amstel until it was lost in 1664 when the English invaded.
So you remember the rubber band story. I think when you talk about the Connecticut River, you get an even more peculiar take on the fringes of New Netherland. In Hartford, Connecticut, on the Connecticut River, there is a site. And back in the 17th century, that was where the Fort of Good Hope was located, a Dutch fort. It was a very small fort. I always had the feeling that it was more of a house than it was an actual fortified fortress. And Fort Good Hope had I think it was really kind of threatened by the English very early on. It seemed like the English were starting to settle in and around the fort right from the beginning.
Right. The English attitude was to crowd the Dutch out. They kept sending people in to move further and further west. The Dutch would be farming, and they would come in and start knocking their fences down and pushing in on their land. They kept crowding the Dutch further and further west. Originally, the Dutch claimed all the way to Cape Cod, Cape Malabar, it was called by the Dutch. But eventually they lost everything to the English simply because they had the population.
And I think if you can recall the dilapidated fort on the Delaware River, Stuyvesant's resources are really stretched to the limit. He can barely take care of the fort here in Manhattan, much less the fort in Albany and the fort in Newcastle and this little fort on the Connecticut River. So he's trying, I think, to kind of consolidate his efforts.
What the problem was at that time, if you remember, there was the first Anglo-Dutch War. It began in 1652 and didn't end until 1654. And it was during this period of time that there was feared that the English colonies in New England were going to unify and attack New Netherlands. So Stuyvesant felt that he had, and he says it in this manner, it is better to protect the heart than to protect the extremities. He protected the heart by pulling soldiers, gunpowder, cannon out of Fort Casimir on the Delaware River. That's why it was in such poor shape. Was because he was protecting Manhattan.
So Manhattan, this is a painting of the